Okay, today we're going to talk about building a UI for the average player and why you should build your own UI instead of using somebody else's. Before we begin, let's talk about there's two conflicting forces when you're talking about building a UI. There's the idea of aesthetic and there's the idea of utility. So an aesthetic UI, basically an aesthetic UI, you can hear this, people will talk about it being a bit of a clean UI, but the central idea behind an aesthetic UI is kind of like the default Blizzard UI. So I've got the default Blizzard UI to a degree, not quite, but pretty close. I've got the default Blizzard UI, and the big thing you'll notice is that this whole huge center view is completely open. I can see all the beautiful artwork that Blizzard has done, right? So it's very immersive. That's aesthetic. So we'll call that an aesthetic UI, where I can just see all the artwork. It's great for exploration, right? It's great for leveling. It's great for exploration where things aren't particularly dangerous. So this gives me a chance to go and look around, explore, enjoy the world. As you start getting into group content, though, PvP, dungeons, raiding, you need to start moving away from completely open aesthetic UI to a more utilitarian UI. So a utilitarian UI is a UI that delivers a lot of information that's easily accessible. So let's take an extreme example, for a second. A hardcore raid leader. And so the difference between a hardcore raider and a hardcore raid leader is the raid leader really needs to monitor everything. So you can kind of imagine for a hardcore raid leader, what are they going to have to do? Well, assuming they're in the raid, they have to monitor their health and of course the target's health, the boss's health. They have to monitor cooldowns of abilities, their own abilities, but they may also have to monitor cooldowns of their group's abilities. They have to monitor upcoming, events. So the boss's debuffs, buffs, abilities, what have you, right? So, and of course we monitor those in different ways, but you can kind of imagine there's a lot of information they have to take in. And the more information you have to take in, the more utilitarian your UI becomes. So today, this video is not aimed at the hardcore raider, okay? Because most of us are not hardcore raiders. We fall somewhere in the middle, right? I'm going to say most people who do something to their UI, who don't use the default UI, probably fall in somewhere between maybe let's say LFR and heroic, depending on what your game is. Right? Maybe you dabble a little bit in mythic, but you're not a world first raider, so your needs aren't as, I'm not going to say they're not as important, but you don't need necessarily as much information as a world first raider needs. Let's put it that way. So then the question becomes, how do we balance aesthetic versus utility? For a lot of us, I speak for myself, I like having an aesthetic UI because I do a lot outside of raiding, right? I do world quest, I do all sorts of stuff. I like to view the world, so I do a lot of world exploration. So I do like having a nice, open, very accessible UI. On the other hand, I do raiding too. I heroic raid. And so there's definitely things that I need to track. So let's see what we can do in terms of making a UI and customizing a UI that fits your particular needs. And that's what I want to emphasize here. This is why I think it's important that you build your own UI instead of necessarily grabbing somebody else's. Okay? And the reason being is their needs may be tailored much more to what they're doing, right? If you're grabbing a world first Raiders UI and you're not a hardcore Raider or a world first Raider, then you're probably doing it wrong, right? Their needs are going to be very much different. If you do LFR and you're grabbing a world first Raider, your UI, you're just not getting what they're getting out of it, right? Do you need to track everything in LFR? Probably not, right? Mechanics are fairly forgiving. So in terms of what you need to keep track of, you need a lot less. So it doesn't make much sense to copy a World First Rater's UI if you're not a World First Rater, right? So that being said, let's talk about some of the important things. When you're building your UI, you need to decide what is important to you, right? Specifically to you and performing your job. So right now I look at this UI that the default Blizzard UI, and while it's great for maybe questing, it's not good for much else. Some things that I need. Again, this is coming from my own perspective. Maybe you look at this and you go, you know what, I raid with this all the time. This is great. Well, great. If it works for you, fantastic. Don't fix it. But for myself, it's not going to work. So here's some things that don't work for me. One, I want to be able to track, even while I'm on my Resto Druid and I heal, I still would like to be able to easily track, especially while I'm questing and things like that, or if I'm doing mythic dungeons. I want to be able to easily track my own health, which I can do through raid frames, and I usually do. But I also want to be able to track my target. So being off in the corner is bad. So our central vision is right here. This is where all the action goes on, right? This is where, so if something's on the ground, you want to make sure you're getting out of it. This is where your field of view should be here. You don't want to be looking off to these corners, right? That's just, you're not monitoring stuff that's off here. So for example, if my field of vision is right here in the center, I'm not looking here. And so there's a good chance if my health bar is up here that there's a good chance I'm going to probably die at some point because I'm not checking the fact, oh, look, I'm taking damage. So one of the first things you'll see, and probably one of the first things you've probably already done, is we've taken our frames and we've moved them more towards the center. Now, when I say more towards the center, it kind of depends on you. If I'm on a healer, I don't necessarily need to be right here or right centered, right? So let's see if I can get, where's my target? Why is my target down there? So these are not my normal frames. So if I was a healer, this doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for me. And the reason being is, while I am looking at my own health and I am looking at the target, my real focus is the raid frames, right? I'm really monitoring everybody else's, including my own. I'm not looking at the target a ton. Now, that being said, if I run Mythic Plus right, maybe my focus is a lot more on the target because I am DPSing a lot. So again, notice how it's being tailored to yourself. So for myself, I'm a raider. So as a healer, yes, I like to monitor myself, but it doesn't need to be necessarily front and center. And yes, I do like to monitor target. Again, doesn't necessarily need to be front and center. So what I'd prefer to do is kind of spread these off to the side, give myself a little bit of room so that maybe I can put some UI elements here. What sort of UI elements would I like? Well, I want to know my cooldowns. As a healer, I want to have all my cooldowns. I don't want to be, again, looking down here, not a good thing. Right? If I'm looking down here, then I'm missing what's going on over here. I'm missing what's going on underneath my feet, and I'm missing my raid frames. So I'll put usually, right, I'm going to want my cooldowns front and center. Whatever cooldowns I'm looking for, anything that has any kind of cooldown, right? So whether it's a short cooldown like this, like Wild Growth, or it's a longer cooldown like Iron Bark, I'm going to want to be able to monitor those, and I'd like to keep them relatively central to my vision. That being said, and then actually before we continue, because I'm a healer, I want to keep my raid frames central to my vision. So for me, I put my raid frames right here. Again, default, Blizzard raid frames are over here. This is not a good spot for them, right? If I'm a healer, it's not a good spot. If I'm a DPS, probably a fine spot. A DPS isn't necessarily monitoring everybody's raid frames. They may be to a degree, especially if they're raid leading. But for the most part, for a DPS, having the raid frames over here, that's fine. But for a healer, I want them front and center. So with that being said, I'm going to now show you my UI, and I'm going to discuss why I've put what I've put. The big thing here that I really want to emphasize again is don't just take what I put out here and just copy it, because it is specific to my situation, right? I'm a raider, a heroic raider. So I'm not a Mythic Raider. I'm not an LFR Raider. I don't do Mythic Plus very often. So for me, I am pretty much mostly just healing. There's some DPS that I need to do a little bit, but for the most part, I'm just healing. So let's go and look at my personal raid frames here. So I'm going to enable some add-ons here. So I will do details. Let's see here. Weak auras and shadow unit frames. There we are. So, and then I'll give you kind of the reasoning behind my reasoning. Why I did what I did. Okay. Whoops. Let's do dominoes also. I also had dominoes, so let's do that. There we go. Okay, so here is my healing raid UI. Now I will tell you this part right here, these cooldowns, I actually usually have them invisible when I'm out of combat, but I have them currently, I'm having them showing for discussion purposes. But again, they would normally be invisible. I would have liked to have shown my raid frames right here. In fact, if you want to look at them, I usually have raid frames. Let's put them here. So my raid frames are usually, so my UI setup, it kind of looks like this. Let's talk about why this works for me, and again, why it may not work for you. So when I said don't necessarily copy somebody's UI, I really do believe that, because mine is set up specifically for me. It's showing me what I need to see in a way that allows me to get my the information I want easily, right? While it's still balancing aesthetic. Because again, remember at the beginning I talked about there's this idea of aesthetic, there's this idea of utility. I don't need a ton of utility, right? As a non-hardcore raider, I don't need to track every little tiny thing, but there's definitely some things that I do need to track. So let's talk about, I'm going to close this up here. Let's talk about some of the decisions I made. Again, you'll notice as a healer, my healing frame, my target's frame are pretty far apart. They're not quite centered. If I was a DPS, I'd pull those in together. But my eyes usually are right around here. This kind of, if you make a rectangle right here, this is where my eyes are. So up here is where I'm dodging mechanics. Right here is where I'm watching my cooldowns. And right here is where I'm monitoring the raid's health. I don't look here very often. Okay? It's not that I don't use them at all. I just don't use them very often. If I was a DPS, on the other hand, I'd probably move these in because I'd want to monitor my own health. I'd also want to monitor the target. I want to be interrupting, looking for debuffs and buffs and things like that. So I pull those things in closer because they'd be more important to me as a DPS. As a healer, though, I had to decide. You'll notice I don't have a lot of skills being shown, right? There's a lot more skills as a druid that I have. I don't have any of my DPS skills being shown. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, 99% of what I do in a raid is heal. So seeing DPS stuff for myself as a heroic healer, don't need it too much. When I do DPS, I can monitor things like dots by looking at my plater add-on. I could look at my add-on, right? So I can kind of monitor those things. If my DPS is not great, that's fine, because my job is really to heal. Again, if I was a world first raider where DPS becomes more important, I might want to actually monitor my DPS stuff down here along with my cooldowns, because suddenly it's really important that I optimize my DPS. But at my level of play, I don't need to optimize my DPS. I like to optimize my healing, though. That being said, what I've done is I try the idea behind mine is I want to express this to you because I think it's the idea that you should have behind yours too, is have your UI show as little as possible while still giving you everything you need. So you need to decide, what is it that you need? What is it that you absolutely need? For myself, I need to monitor my cooldowns, right? So I've got kind of my single target shorter cooldowns, not this one, of course. That's more of an AoE. But I've got some single target kind of bread and butter cooldowns off to the left. I've got my longer raid-wide cooldowns off to the right, and I've got some utility to the bottom. Notice, 3 sections. I don't think of this in terms of 12 buttons. Well, actually, technically 13, because there's this bar right here, monitors life bloom. So I don't tend to think of these in terms of 13 different things. I think of these in terms of really 3 areas. Area 1, bread and butter. Area 2, cooldown. Area 3, utility. Notice how easy that is to keep your eyes on, because when things are getting busy, right, if this is 13 things, 13 kind of random stuff that I just grabbed from somebody else's UI, or maybe 15 different random buttons that are placed for them, again, maybe it's good for them, but not for me, then all of a sudden I have to track 13 different things. I need to know where those 13 different skills are. While in this case, because I've got this broken down into groups, right, subgroups, I only have 3 subgroups. So there's only 3 things for me technically to monitor while I am monitoring more. So again, what are the things that I need specifically? Well, I need to monitor my skill cooldowns. I also need to monitor my raid's health and, of course, my own player stuff. That's about it. Now, you'll notice there's some stuff down here. You'll say, well, why aren't you showing all your buttons? Well, I don't need most of the, everything is keybound. So the only things I really need to show are things like this. These are some of the things that I kind of use, that I click on, right? So, for example, my flasks. These are all the sort of stuff that I tend to click on. I don't have keybound, and that's why they're showing. You might say, why don't you have some of these things keybound? I just don't, right? These are the things that I've chosen for myself that work for me. They may not work for you. So again, when you're building your UI, ask yourself, what is important for you specifically? For me, what was important? What was important that as I tracked my skill cooldowns, right, I was able to, if needed, track my own health, which again, I usually do through raid frames, and the target, because sometimes I do need to know the target stuff, especially when I do dungeons. But other than that, I don't need to track a lot. You'll notice, for example, my damage meter's way off to the right. Why? Because I don't look at it except out of combat, right? So when we wipe or we're running to the next boss or whatever, I'll kind of maybe flip through this a little bit, but I don't see it during the raid, right? It's not an important element for me. Maybe it is for you. When I also, you'll notice, you can't see this here, but my bigwigs cooldown, I have my bars over here for bigwigs for the most part. You'll notice they're kind of out of the way. I know where they are, but for the most part, they're out of the way for me here because at this point we've been raiding, Castle Nathria for, I don't know how many months now, right? A number of months. I know the cooldowns. I know when things are coming up pretty intuitively. Not perfectly, but pretty intuitively. And of course, I have my bigwig calling things out anyway, anything that I don't remember that's coming out. So yes, I do like to look at the bars every once in a while. I'll kind of glance over here to the left and see something that's coming up. But for the most part, I'm not looking there, right? It's a once in a while thing, so it's okay to have it over here. Again, for my main central vision, look how little I have. I'm keeping it simple, and that allows me to focus on what I need to know. If I crowded this stuff up, there's some things that are definitely missing, right? So for example, I could have some damaging skills being shown. I could have some more utility skills being shown, but I don't use them a lot. And I don't necessarily need to use them on cooldown. So for example, what's a good example? I am looking here. So, for example, Tiger's Dash, right? It's on a 45-second cooldown. You might say, well, why isn't that? That's a pretty important skill, and I use it a lot. But for the most part, I can keep track of Tiger's Dash kind of mentally. I'm not using it on cooldown. I'm using it when I need it. And I kind of know when I need it, right? I don't use it all the time. So it's, for the most part, it's up when I need it. And so I don't necessarily need to monitor it. Like I said, maybe you do. Maybe you're like, I use that all the time. I want to make sure it's up every 45 seconds. Then yeah, you should be monitoring it. I don't need it for me. So again, when you're making your UI, ask what you need to see. What is the most important for you? The most important stuff for you should be right here. Should be in your central field of view. As things get less important, they can move off to the sides a bit. So another thing that I have is, as a healer, I like to track other healing cooldowns and things like that the other healers have. And I have that off to the side over here. I could move it more central if I was raid leading, or if I was maybe even heal leading, right? Maybe I'd move it off a little more central so I keep track of it. But for the most part, I just have it over here because I'll say, you know what? I need an innervate. I'll look over here. Is there anyone who has an innervate available? And of course there isn't, because nobody's playing Druid. Again, so instead of going and grabbing somebody else's UI, it's okay to get inspiration, right? It is absolutely okay to get inspiration. It's okay to look at somebody and say, wow, I really like the look of that, and I'd like to see if I can make that work for myself by changing some things up. Getting inspiration is great, but just grabbing somebody's UI and trying to make it work for you is a bad idea, because you're now taking their thought process, and you don't necessarily even know what their thought process was when they put it together, right? So if you were to grab mine and you are a mythic dungeon, that's your game, this probably doesn't work out well for you. So grabbing just my UI wouldn't be great, right? Because I'm not showing my DPS cooldowns. I'm not tracking my dots. I'm not doing those different things that you would do in Mythic Plus. So this is not a good Mythic Plus UI. So grabbing it for yourself, if you don't understand the thought process behind it, right? If you don't understand that thought process that goes behind creating it, then you're just grabbing somebody else's stuff and not understanding what it's for, right? And that's why I really want to emphasize, when you look at if you're grabbing a high level player, right? A Mythic Raider, high key pusher in Mythic Plus, and you just grab theirs, understand it's probably, for the most part, it's probably not going to work for you. Again, they have, as a high level Mythic player, can probably track more than you can, right? So I understand that, when you look at a Mythic, a world first Raider, I understand that they are able to track more than I can. They are a better player than I am, right? And they can maybe take in more information than I can. So them having more skills available, them monitoring whatever else they need to monitor, right? Maybe they're monitoring all their, the cooldowns and things like that for the raid. You'll see it's a lot busier. But part of that is they are able to take that information in. If you can't take it in, right? If you have information on your screen that's central that you can't take in, then why is it there, right? All it's doing is crowding your field of view. It's ruining your aesthetic, but it's also ruining your gameplay, because you're not as able to see as much. So I'm going to end it there. Hopefully you keep those things in your mind when you're building your own UI.